Hi, and welcome to my session about entering a new era of cybersecurity with Microsoft 365 Defender. My name is Michael, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to get most out of Microsoft 365 Defender and why it is so important to help organizations, people become more secure in this challenging era, in this challenging cybersecurity landscape. But before I do, I want to thank the sponsors for making this conference and this session possible. Without these sponsors, events like this wouldn't be possible at all, right? The community is something where you can learn a lot. I learn from the community on a daily basis, and as such, I'm really happy to see that so many organizations support that as well, make information sharing possible. And as you will learn, community is a really important part, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a threat intelligence perspective. And in cybersecurity in general, what you learn from one another is what makes it really valuable and how you can increase not just your knowledge, but also your defenses. So make sure to check out the sponsors and thank them for making this possible. And, maybe, you can learn a little bit from them and see what their products and services are all about. Now, this being said, a little bit about myself. My name is Michael van Horenbeeck. I run a consulting company called The Collective Consulting. I've got a long history in messaging and collaboration. I've been a long-time MVP as well, mainly, primarily in the exchange world, but then a couple of years back I shifted to security because I really thought there was a need for more security, and I haven't been proven wrong, right? The number of attacks, the number of threats and vulnerabilities have become vast. They increase in complexity. It's a challenging and interesting world to be in. But this being said, the reason why I'm talking to you about is, it's one of my passions, both Microsoft and cybersecurity. And as Microsoft to me now is a security vendor, 1 + 1 = 3, not just 2. And so what I want to talk to you about today is why I think Microsoft 365 Defender is so important to organizations, and why that novelty approach, albeit maybe not entirely novelty, is really, really, really important. And that is because security is more than just protecting assets. For a long time, and still today, I work with a lot of organizations and people that focus primarily or solely or almost entirely on protecting their assets, their environment, on making sure they have the proper tools and solutions to stop threats from entering their environment. And the way I try and explain it to them is it's great, right? You can try and stop the wave, but ultimately the wave will grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and it'll overrun you. So being able to protect your environment obviously is an important part of cybersecurity, but it isn't just everything, right? And this is why I added the NIST cybersecurity framework. I'm a big fan of it, of the approach that or the structure that the framework provides, because it kind of divides cybersecurity in multiple phases, in multiple types of activities, starting with identify, then protect, detect, respond, recover. And each of these phases map to activities that you should perform in order to increase your security posture of your environment. For instance, in the identification phase, you're going to look for, what's really a threat to you, what's a vulnerability in your environment. And then you move to the protection phase, where you're going to address those vulnerabilities by protecting your environment, by adding tools and solutions to harden your environment, your solutions, your applications. And then from the mindset of assume breach, making sure that you can't stop everything. There is no such thing as 100% security. You move to detection, response, and recoverability phases, where you make sure you detect activities, that you can respond to them if they're happening. And if everything else fails, you have to have a strategy to recover from the attacks. Even if there is an attack that you were able to stop, there might be adverse effects. There might be parts of the attack that were successful. So you need to have that recoverability, or that strategy around recoverability as well. So the question I'm often asked is, well, how does Microsoft play in the NIST cybersecurity framework or in cybersecurity in general, and how does that pertain to Microsoft 365 Defender? Well, in order to do that, let's first take a look at the anatomy of a modern day attack, where the different phases a typical attack goes through. And it usually starts with reconnaissance, where an attacker, and reconnaissance is mostly related to targeted attacks. So for the sake of argument here, let's say that you are being targeted, and someone that is going after your assets because you have something valuable or just because they think it's interesting. They will try and figure out who's you, right? What's your environment look like. They're going to try and leverage public information or information that is involuntarily published to try and figure out how they can best approach you. And when I say information that is involuntarily published, I mean things that people voluntarily put on the internet but don't necessarily think of as exposing parts of the environment. For instance, people in the IT department posting stuff about challenges they've had in the environment, blog posts, tweets, and so forth and so on. But not just that. There's also developers that may be developing applications for you and whom are posting or keeping their code repos in GitHub, in a public GitHub, and sometimes they forget to scrub them for secrets, credentials, and so forth and so on. So by taking all that information, they can figure out what your environment looks like. They maybe already have credential material that they could leverage later or that they can use to gain an initial foothold. And once they've built their case, let's say, the phase of initial access starts. They have to have an in, and there's multiple ways of doing that, much more than what's on screen. But typically what we see is that phishing is by far and large still the most popular way, right? The phishing email is being sent where people are being tricked into, either going to a malicious website, which as some sort of drive-by compromise tries to download an attachment, or there is a phishing email where the attachment is already included and they're enticing the end user to open up the attachment, which ultimately will lead to the exploitation of that vulnerability or a vulnerability or anything. So that's going to run on that device and compromise that device, and from there all hell breaks loose, I would say. Now, what vulnerability or bug they're going to exploit really depends on your environment. This is what makes every attack or targeted attack really unique. If you're using a specific version of Adobe or another application, by exposing the fact that you're using that application, they might try and leverage a specific vulnerability. And it's not necessarily that they're gonna, prepackage everything immediately and try multiple vulnerabilities and bugs in order to compromise a device. What we see is that the initial attack, targets specific vulnerabilities on a device in order to establish a foothold from which they can then launch further attacks on the device on other applications. So let's assume that you've downloaded an application which installs Cobalt Strike or anything that establishes a reverse shell on the device. The attackers now have persistent access to that device. And then one of the things that they're going to do is, obviously, have that phone home where they can interactively interact with that device, where they can engage with the device, send commands remotely for that device to execute. And they might do that immediately. They might wait a little bit of time, but they will try and stay under the radar, right? Because a successful attacker doesn't generally generate these high-level critical alerts unless it's too late. They're going to try and stay under the radar and live in the lows and the mediums where most of the noise is in most of the solutions. Now, from that compromised device, they're going to do another discovery round. Provided they don't already exactly know what's happening in the environment, they're going to try and figure out where they can move to, what the other devices are, how your device is connected to the rest of the network. And that phase may, take a little bit of time. But ultimately, the goal of doing that discovery is to find other targets they can attack, right? And then obviously compromise and do other stuff with. But the idea is not just to compromise devices. It may be a goal by itself where you ultimately want to launch a ransomware attack on multiple devices, but they want to move laterally across the environment. They want to, get from one system to another, and most of the time the goal is to elevate privileges, not just locally on the device, but within the environment, where a regular user account ultimately becomes a admin account on a set of devices or a server, and from that admin account on a server, they get an admin account on a different server, and then ultimately, they might try and get, a dominance over the domain, where they get the credentials for a global admin or a domain admin, and basically at that point in time, it's game over. It probably was game over a while ago, but once someone has domain admin credentials, then everything is compromised, especially in the on-prem environment. But as soon as someone gets your global admin credentials, and provided those aren't protected by other measures, then they now have access over the entire environment. They can delete log files. They can hide their persistence or their presence. They can modify settings. They can expose data. Basically, bad things happen. And depending on the type of attack, either it's one to generate impact, where they want to hurt you, where they want to ransom your data, where they want to get money from you, or it's just covert, where people want to get access to sensitive data. And the important part there is that in a lot of attacks, they aren't just trying to get to the global admin or the higher privileged accounts to exfiltrate data. As soon as they have one compromised device, one compromised account, they already have access to data, and that data could already be sensitive information. Let's say it's your DPO or your CEO. It's one account, but they have access to lots of information. And typically what we see is that from that one account, that one device, data exfil already starts. So there's a lot of components here at play, and obviously there's a lot of complexity involved, because I may make it sound simple where, they do this and they do that and this goes like this. And a really good attacker might be able to do that and exploit that really well. But today, if you have a well-managed environment, exploiting a bug or a vulnerability isn't easy. But at some point, you'll have to assume that people can do it. And I don't want to, throw Microsoft or anyone else under the bus, but even the best teams in the world, whether it's, FireEye, Microsoft, and so forth and so on, they can be vulnerable to very complex attacks. So if they are vulnerable, you could too. And it's not because, some organizations take the stance of, well, I've got nothing to hide, there's nothing to get from me, that it means there isn't anything to get from you. Even your internal data could be a competitive advantage to another organization. So there's always some value for you to be found. And it's true that, if you're a construction company, then chances are an attacker will not spend as much time and money as they do or did trying to attack Microsoft or SolarWinds or any other organization worldwide. But you're still at risk of being compromised in one way or another. So now that we understand the anatomy of the attack, let's take a look at a little bit of the challenges. Well, given there is such an exposure, a large exposure that you're facing, obviously there is a lot of cost associated with that as well. You need to have proper solutions in place in order to protect yourself, to defend your assets, your environment from such attacks. So it can quickly become rather costly, and it becomes even more costly if you try and do everything on your own. Right? And what do I mean is that in cybersecurity, organizations have had a history of trying to purchase the best of breed. It's kind of like buying a car or building a car yourself, building the best engine you can get, the best chassis you can get, the best brakes you can get, the best wheels you can get. That makes the best of breed of everything, but then you still have to put things together. And that's no guarantee that the car will handle well and will drive well. It's not because you have the best components that you have the best car. You will still be bested by a car where each of the components has been tailored and connected to one another to work in perfect combination with one another. Plus, as I just illustrated, there is a lot of complexity with modern attacks, but also the technology behind stuff. As we evolve to hybrid environments, more towards the cloud, it's not that things become simpler. There is more systems, there is different ways of interacting, there is multiple ways of connecting from on-prem or the offices from at home through a VPN, no VPN, and so forth and so on. There is a plethora of options and capabilities, making that things really become complex, right? And not just in cybersecurity, but in general. And as such, if you bring one and one together, what we see is that today in cybersecurity, and that's a general number, there's almost 3 million unfilled vacancies worldwide. It shows that there is a lack of expertise, a lack of knowledge, and that could be tool-specific knowledge, product-specific knowledge, but also knowledge about your environment, about the threats, the vulnerabilities. And because things evolve so fast, it is really, really hard to keep up. Personally, I think that we're at the brink of a new, a revolution in cybersecurity, where organizations typically build their own security operations center, and they can still do so. The value of that security operations center is the fact that you have business context and expertise at hand, and you can combine them. But it should no longer be something that is only for the happy few or the ones that can spend that much money. I foresee that security operations, which we're going to come or talk about in just a minute, is going to take a leading role in making sure that organizations can leverage the solutions they have and become more secure, even if you have to outsource parts of it. But it's going to be a joint effort where you, as an organization, bring context about the organization and about what's important to you, versus an external party bringing expertise to the table and making sure that you can work together and create a complete or build a complete defense, a 360 degrees defense, not one just based on context or just based on expertise, but where both find one another. And another challenge is kind of fueled by that complexity is visibility, or the lack thereof. As I mentioned, there's no way that you can keep people out. It's like locks on a door. Eventually someone will be able to pick the locks. Nothing is 100% safe. So if nothing is 100% safe, you have to make sure that you can detect a breach, that you can detect malicious activity, or at least an attempt of getting into your environment. And what we find is that lots of organizations have, dead spots where they have no visibility, and it's part because it's a shift that is happening right now, and it's because applications haven't been built to provide that visibility. So again, there is lots of challenges around solving that visibility challenge, and even starting with the workplace, like Microsoft 365. If you have these point solutions, then you want to combine information from the different workloads so that someone's trying to enter in the front door, but have they first tried the back door, or have they already been able to infiltrate elsewhere? You want to take that leverage, or take and leverage that information across the multiple domains within your environment, and specifically here, what we're talking about, Microsoft 365. So let's go back to the attack that I described earlier, right, where we have the different phases. So how does Microsoft 365 or Microsoft 365 Defender fit in the entire story? Well, let's start by Microsoft 365 Defender, or Microsoft Defender for Office 365. It protects various phases of an attack, right? It can make sure that it detects phishing emails, blocks them, that it detects phishing links, prevents you from clicking them, or at least records the fact that you clicked them, depending on the use case, and so forth and so on. So that provides protection and visibility at the same time. And if you take into consideration the automated investigation and response capabilities that live within Office 365, you now have covered 3 phases of the NIST cybersecurity framework. You've got detection, protection, detection, and response, right? Protect, detect, respond. These 3 phases have been covered by Microsoft Defender for Office 365. If you then move another phase, or move on to another phase, we have Defender for Endpoint, which protects everything happening on the endpoint. It collects lots of telemetry to provide visibility into the activities going on, but it will also, prevent running malicious code, detect running malicious code. If you're dealing with a 0-day, can go back in time. It records that for a long period of time, So basically, it provides protection, detection, and response capabilities, again, for everything happening on the endpoint. So this is why, again, you cover lots of phases of the NIST cybersecurity phases with Defender for Endpoint. Moving one step further, you have Identity Protection in Azure AD and Microsoft Defender for Identity, or the old Azure ATP, which can take a look at what's happening in your Active Directory, which can detect lateral account movements, suspicious activity basically based on your identity, and it can combine that information from an on-premises environment with the information in Azure Active Directory as well. So that phase where people are trying to elevate privileges, move laterally, can easily be detected by Defender for Identity, which ultimately brings us to the phase of, exfiltration. And this is where MCAS can help, or Microsoft Defender 365 as a whole can help to detect and combine the signals from everything else to make sure that, if data is being exported, that you get an alert about malicious, or the anomalous activities like major downloads or suspicious deletions or number of deletions. And again, this is where everything comes together, right? Where information can be shared across all these platforms to provide a significant higher level of protection, but mainly detection and response. Because Microsoft 365 Defender, or Microsoft Defender 365, is it's a XDR, right? Cross-workload, cross-platform detection and response capability. So consider all the solutions that I just mentioned. They gather vast amounts of data. And the example that I'll show you in a demo in just a minute will do just that. It gathers information and it can share information with the other platforms, allowing Microsoft 365 Defender to correlate information. Kind of like a SIEM would, where a SIEM typically does it manually, where you define a use case, where you tell it what it needs to look for, even though that's no longer true, because we're going to talk a little bit about Azure Sentinel as well. But considering an old school SIEM, you told it what to look for and it then went out and looked for stuff. Well, MD365 does it in the same way, but it does it in a much smarter way. It already has access to everything. So it can go and look for a phishing email that was linked to a malicious attachment that was ran on an endpoint, where ultimately someone, from that device that was compromised tried to elevate privileges, and it can combine that, all these signals, all these alerts potentially, and add them into a single incident, so that as a responder you immediately have the information you need. But also let's consider this. An email came in, a phishing email came in that was originally not marked as being suspicious. Maybe because that email was sent through a business partner. And we see this happening very often, where one organization is compromised, and rather than attacking that organization, they're leveraging access to that other organization to target other organizations and send legitimate emails with phishing links and malicious content, malicious attachments. Now, even malicious attachments aren't always recognized by Defender for Office 365 or any other solution, right? Add them to a password protected zip and, it cannot be scanned. Now, some organizations block that content by default, others don't. So it's really depending on the configuration of your own environment. But what I'm trying to say is that, that first layer of defense is not infallible. Right? So maybe an attachment got through to the machine, and maybe the awareness of the user wasn't up to par, and maybe they executed the content, and maybe because they did, the device is now compromised. But because there is a chain, right, there is a link of information that is available to MD365, it can take that information and trace its steps back to the origin. Like, when a device was compromised by an executable, well, where did that executable come from? It can actually go into the telemetry of Defender for Endpoint and see, where it originated. And if it originated from Outlook or an email, it can go back to MD365 or Office 365 and ask you, like, I've got an attachment here. Where was it sent from? Who did it send? To whom was it sent? So it can proactively go out and defend other organizations. And the beauty of this is that it's not only bringing value for your organization, it's also value cross organizations, because it is crowdsourcing in a way, right? What's happening in your environment within a matter of minutes is or the intelligence thereof is available to the rest of the world. So even if you're the one being targeted first, you're helping other people stay safe. And the other way around, other people leveraging Microsoft's products, if they're being targeted, you're automatically, based on that behavior, based on what the system learned, protected from future attacks. And that is really important, because do you remember when I started off and said that community is important? There's two ways to look at communities, right? It's the voluntary communities, the communities, people exchanging information, blog posts, tweets, threat intelligence. But there's also a community of connected systems that can help each other to learn from signals and data and indicators of attack and compromise to keep environments safe. And that in itself is a really, really, really important thing to consider. So let's move on to the last slide a little bit and talk about the importance of SecOps. As I mentioned earlier, right, you can't stop the wave. You can try and ride the wave. You can learn how to ride the wave, but you definitely can't stop it. And even though the NIST cybersecurity framework has 5 different phases, there's 3 that I really want you to, put in your head. It's protect, detect, respond, right? Whenever you do something, whenever you take a look at a threat, a vulnerability, or a risk, make sure to, cover these phases. Protect from a risk, and then figure out, if my protection fails, how do I detect? Can I detect? Do I detect? And if I do, how do I respond? What can I do to respond? What is my playbook? And some of these response capabilities will be automatic, right? Where the system will respond for you. But sometimes it means that you'll have to go in and disable an account. And it's something that you could maybe automate. And that's what I mean by entering the new era of cybersecurity, is that you'll have to consider all of these things and leverage technology to do that. Now, again, this is where Microsoft really, really, really excels, is they provide a platform where you can combine all of these things, where they will surface alerts, surface incidents, allow you with a single click of a button, respond to these events as well, and therefore very much mature the experiences you have from a cybersecurity perspective, but from a security operations perspective. And the way they do that, and that's what's in the next slide, whereby we kind of leave the attack phases, is going back to the NIST cybersecurity framework and the different products we talked about. Well, as you can see, there is identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? We've got this process again here. And from an identification perspective, there's lots of features buried, or not buried, but available in the different products that allow you to identify the threats to your environment. For instance, threat and vulnerability management in Defender for Endpoint is hugely valuable. It gives you visibility in what is installed, but not just what applications are installed, also what these installed applications mean for your security posture. For instance, what's the impact on your security posture? Is there a vulnerability? Is that vulnerability known or exploited publicly? If so, it kind of increases it. And what type of increases the importance of the vulnerability? And by giving you that visibility, it also gives you a prioritization of what you focus on. The threats and vulnerabilities with a higher impact on your environment are the ones that you should tackle first. Doesn't mean that you have to forget about everything else, but it helps you, prioritizing the work that you need to do, and tells you which applications and which software you should patch first. But TVM, kind of along with Secure Score, is also a way to measure the configuration of your environment. It's the Cloud Security Posture Management, or posture management in general. It tells you, what you could do in order to protect the defenses. For instance, Defender for Endpoint, the TVM module will tell you that you can enable attack surface reduction rules, and how those attack surface reduction rules will help you, lower the attack surface and therefore jump or make a jump forward in terms of protecting your assets and your devices. Moving to the protection phase, obviously we've got these cutting edge technologies in Defender for Office 365, in Defender for Endpoint, including a next-gen protection, so the next-gen antivirus, attack surface reduction rules, the malware scanning through in the cloud and MCAS, exploit protection on the endpoint, basically everything you can do to prevent an attack from unfolding or from becoming successful. But from the assume breach mindset, we know that we have to do things to detect and respond, which is where the EDR capabilities, the XDR capabilities of MD365 come into play, where MCAS does user and entity behavioral analytics, literally goes out and searches for anomalies in activities, which is great because we're now leveraging AI to look and sift through large sets of data and try to find anything out of the ordinary. And why is that so important? Well, remember when I said earlier that an attacker will try and live in the lows and the mediums, right? They will try and stay under the radar. Well, because they try and stay under the radar, they will hopefully not trigger any alerts. Now, there's a side effect to this is that when you take a look at the low and the medium alerts in your environment, there is, in general, a lot more of them, right? Potentially even that many that one or two alerts that are, true positives might go undetected or go unnoticed. But if you then take these signals and compare them towards a baseline where the baseline may be flat and you see these spikes or deviations, basically you're looking for anomalies from your baseline, then you can start detecting things and raise it or at least generate awareness. And this is where it's really important to understand that behavioral analytics aren't the panacea and they won't detect all the attacks. They will also generate false positives because it's not because there's spikes in activity or there is a deviation in activities that it means that it is malicious per se. A good example is when an alert is thrown that there is an anomalous amount of data downloads. Well, generally speaking, I synchronize my OneDrive for Business on my device. And if tomorrow I get a new device and I start synchronizing everything again, I'm downloading my entire OneDrive again from SharePoint Online. At that point in time, that might actually trigger an alert and say, well, Michael is downloading lots of data, which he usually doesn't. He hasn't done that in a year. Well, it doesn't mean that it is malicious, but it does raise the attention on some of the activities. However, if, it happens on my previous device, that might actually, showcase that my device was compromised. Someone's downloading on my behalf, or maybe it was just me downloading it again. Maybe it's a good signal to use because, downloading large amounts of data can also mean that I'm trying to exfiltrate the data myself because I know I'm leaving your organization. I mean, no matter what the reasons is, it brings visibility, and that's the point. Now, moving away from the detection phase, going into the response phase, as I mentioned earlier, there's automated investigation and response in Defender for Office 365 and Defender for Endpoint, which will automatically kick off remediations on a machine when, alert comes in, an incident is there. It will investigate and then propose and sometimes even take action to remediate the activity. It could block an executable, but you could also combine it with your own playbooks, right? Where you can say, whenever such an alert comes in, I want you to disable the user, email that, do this, do that. Again, the flexibility of the cloud and the integration with logic apps makes it a lot easier for you to respond, but also it allows you to respond, right? Because you're using the tools that are already there. And this is something, hugely powerful, and it will only become more and more important in the future. So with that being said, let's just take a look at MD365 and the capabilities it has. So what you see here is one of my test environments, actually a little bit of live data as well. And we're here in the new Microsoft 365 Security Center. As you may have noticed recently, they've combined everything of the different applications except for MCAS in the portal itself. And I can understand why, because even though data of MCAS is flowing in the portal here, MCAS has a use right on its own as well, right? There are specific use cases that are MCAS specific, and it could be a product on its own. And ultimately, I imagine that we'll keep both portals for a period of time. But the most important parts, Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office 365, Defender for Identity, or at least the data thereof, are in the portal here today. And what most people are going to be interested in is the incidents and the alerts. Now, as I said, this is a test environment, so there's not much going on except the things that I generated. And what you can see here is an overview of the 2 incidents that happened in the environment. And as you can see, it also tells you where those incidents were raised or where those alerts came from. For instance, impossible travel activity is something that is raised or detected by Cloud App Security, and then through Cloud App Security is raised in this dashboard. Same goes for anything that is antivirus or EDR detections. Those are surfaced here as well. And from here, by clicking on them, you can actually pivot into more information, into more details about what happened. And what I like about MD365 is that it brings the information to you. So even if I'm novel, I don't have a lot of cybersecurity knowledge, it kind of takes you by the hand and brings you the information you need. Now, I still need to interpret and need to understand what's happening, but it lowers the bar of getting started by making it super easy for you. Right. And what you can see here is immediately that I clicked an incident, and then I clicked on an alert in the incident, and it tells me, well, what you saw here is a specific activity which is part of an incident, because I'm looking at the alert here. And this alert is something that I'd been working on a while, where someone is trying to evade detection by blocking outbound connectivity for endpoint detection and response, or Defender for Endpoint. And this is now picked up by Defender Antivirus, where it detects, hey, someone's cutting off my communication to the cloud, raises that as an alert and says, this is not great, right? This is something that you should respond on. Typically, unless you're testing and you see something like this, you know that it's really, really bad. Or something that happened by accident. And again, by default, it's categorized as a low priority alert, but depending on your environment, how you manage your devices, this might be something that you want to change and update so that this becomes medium or a high alert right away. And from here, you can pivot into different parts. For instance, let's take a look at the incident itself, right, where the information came from. So what we can see here is that it happened on this device, and we can click on that device and get contextual information for that device. Now, all this information is coming from Defender for Endpoint, right? And immediately we see 3 active alerts on this device, and we can see who the logged on users are, or whom the logged on users were. If this is a primary device of a single user, then obviously, it gives you that visibility, and it'll have one user, and obviously it's a little slow. But if this is a shared device, then you see all the accounts that may be impacted by this alert on this device itself. So we're not going to wait for that. But if you were interested into the account itself, you can then from here on click and continue to the user page as well. Or if I'm more interested in the device, I can open up the device page and get more contextual information about the device itself. And what you can see here is there's a risk assessment level, right? Right now, the risk is still, determined to be rather low, but the exposure level is medium, and that's mainly because there's a bunch of discovered vulnerabilities on the device, which is information coming in from TVM. Now, TVM is part of the identification phase, and it literally highlights, well, hey, look at the exposure level of this machine, which means that if it is being targeted, if there is an alert, chances are that chances are that this device is more likely to be breached versus a device with almost no vulnerabilities and an alert. So again, it can help with contextualizing the alert or the incident and giving more information. But what makes it super easy is that from an alert or an incident to an alert to a device to the TVM information, I immediately see, okay, what the vulnerabilities are. Now I could, within an incident response, do something with this and go out and remediate the vulnerabilities. But typically, especially if it's malware related or suspicious activity, you want to continue investigate things, which is where the timeline, it's part of Defender for Endpoint, comes in handy, especially if you want to take a look at a single machine and understand what happened on that machine as well. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is it's not the point solution, because this is what we're looking at, right? Defender for Endpoint. It's not the point solution that makes it great. It is the combination of the different products. So as you can see here in the portal today, we've got endpoint information, which is Defender for Endpoint. We've got email and collaboration, which gives the information for Microsoft Defender for Office 365, where we have the Threat Explorer, the automated investigations running, and so forth and so on, right? So I'm not going to go into detail about each of these vulnerabilities here, but what we could do here is, for instance, take a look for a specific email that was sent earlier. And the reason why I'm taking this one is I was preparing the demo, and what you can see here is that there, was an email from this email address, really bad actor, and 2 of these emails were blocked, but we also see that 1 email was delivered. Now, that's interesting because, if we know this is a malicious sender because someone flagged it, I was doing some hunting, or I got an alert or a notification from a user, then we might actually look into this. And this is where things become interesting, right? So we know 2 of them have been blocked and that 1 was delivered. And as we can see here is that the original delivery location was quarantine. Now, obviously, what I then did is I released them from quarantine, and the latest delivery location has not yet been updated, which is important because it kind of makes the point that I'm trying to prove here. So we have someone who called help desk and said, I've got this really weird email, or, I got this attachment from Michael, and I ran the attachment, but nothing happened. I'm not too sure. Again, something triggered us to investigate what happened here, right? And first thing you might do is go into the Threat Explorer and take a look at, the single email and what was related to this email. And I didn't conceal it very well because I named it, the subject of the email. This is a malicious attachment, but again, it makes it easier to understand what's happening. So we can dive into the email. We can see the attachments that are part of the email, the file name itself. We can see which devices were touched by that email or the attachment, build an entire timeline, search for similar emails where we can see that the emails were sent from a different IP address, but they are similar because they have a similar subject, probably a similar attachment, and as such were grouped together. So that gives me an idea of, Michael didn't just send an email to Michael, but also to Mike and Dorothy. So let me take a little bit closer look at this. So I could continue to pivot here and get more information there, but personally, I'm a big fan of the hunting capabilities. Now, granted, and I've got my query already prepared here, but granted, this is where things get a little bit tricky. Right? Getting started with KQL requires some getting used to, but honestly, this is a very super great tool, not just from a hunting perspective, but also from a detection and reporting capabilities. There's so many things that you can do with this. For instance, to let you show how easy it is to correlate information across different platforms, what I'm going to do here is, and let's first start with a simple query. I'm going to take a look at email events where the sender from address is this email address. Okay. And provided that, they may have sent multiple emails over a couple of days, you will see more results. But in this case, what we see, there's 3 emails through to my 3 recipients, each of them, same subject. So it seems to be the same message. And again, you see that the first ones were caught as fish, but there's one that was delivered that was not fish. So what I want to do is I want to take that email, and I added the email direction inbound, but it's kind of pointless in this example. I want to take the network message ID and I want to take a look at the attachment itself that was part of the email. So I'm going to join the information from my previous query, right? And I'm going to look in the email attachment info table, which is a separate table here, for the message or the attachments part of this message. So what we can see, again, 3 hits. probably, 3 messages, three times an attachment. And I can see there was a file called readme.zip attached. And that gives me information, like the SHA-256 information for that message as well. Okay, great. So now I have information about that attachment. Well, the first thing I'd like to know is, did that attachment touch any of my other devices? Well, what I then can do is take a look at all the occurrences of that attachment. And what we can see here is that we see that the zip file has been found on, different devices at that point in time. So combining the information again, first what I do is I take the folder path of that zip file, right? Because I know it's been touched or it has been found on a couple of devices, right? We see the device names here. Let me just quickly search for them. You know what? Distinct device name. So let me just quickly run this. So we see that we have the file on a desktop called 4pb24tj. So I want to take this information now and I want to search for, okay, so that's a zip file. Typically what a zip file does is you unzip the zip file and take a file out of it. So I want to see if someone unzipped the zip file on the devices. Now I've got a single hit here, but you could have multiple hits there. So what we're going to do is we're going to first combine what I'm looking for, so the folder path of the zip file, and then I'm going to search for the extraction of the files within the zip file itself. And the way I'm going to do that is with the folder path. And by the way, the folder path is where the zip file is found. I'm going to search for that folder path information in the file origin refer URL. This is the original file name that creates another file, for instance, when you extract a zip file. And I'm going to specifically look for the activities of file created. Now, once you do this, once you run this query, you immediately see that I've got 2 hits, one at 1049 and one at 1110, on the same device where there was a file name called tenor.gif that was or GIF that was generated based on the zip file itself, right? So what it tells me is, someone actually unzipped the zip file, and in this case it's just a GIF, Rickroll GIF, that doesn't do anything harmful, but it could be an HTA or anything else. It could trigger a follow-up on event. Now, is this super useful? Sure, yes, I use it all the time, but parts of this is already done by Defender for Defender 365, right? It has this data, it does this correlation, and it will do lots of that for you as well. If that were a malicious attachment, it will actually go back and automatically do what I'm doing here, right? But what you should know is that it's not just Defender and for Office 365 and for Endpoint. It's also the MCAS information that is available, the TVM information that is available, the Azure AD identity protection or the sign-in events that are available, through which you can build your own detections. And these detections, you can combine them in a detection rule, which, as soon as you have a hit on a specific query, it will raise an alert, and that alert can then raise an incident and so forth and so on. It helps you with detection capabilities. So let's move back to the slide deck for a second and wrap up what we were going to talk about. Right? As I said to you earlier, right, Microsoft Defender 365 is entering a new era of cybersecurity, and it's going to be a very, very, very important first step for a lot of organizations in professionalizing their security operations by increasing their defenses and their protection and detection and response capabilities. But what's next, right? It doesn't stop there. And this is where I believe a solution like Azure Sentinel enhances Microsoft 365's capabilities to the next level, right? It allows you to combine information from different platforms, not just Microsoft 365 Defender, but also external applications, and gather that intelligence into Azure Sentinel and have AI, Fusion for instance, user entity behavioral analytics run on top of that to increase detection, visibility, detection response capabilities, right? It is not a protection platform. This is what MD365 does and Azure Sentinel doesn't, right? But it does further increase the visibility, address the gaps that you may have in your environment. Not necessarily gaps left by Microsoft Defender 365, but gaps of systems integrated with Microsoft Defender 365. Third-party applications that are connected to the cloud that can then give their visibility to Azure Sentinel, and over which you can then reason and fuel that data back to your security operations team so that they can expand their reach beyond your original scope of Microsoft 365. But again, I think organizations that are not there yet, they should start with M365 because it's a mini SIEM in a certain way. It has hunting capabilities as well. And once you harvest that power, it is only logical to evolve using Azure Sentinel. So this being said, I think we're ready to wrap up. Thank you again for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed the session, that you learned a little bit. And I look forward to speaking with you, interacting with you. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them. Thank you again and have a great day.